The flight attendant didn't even look twice as they approached the gate in a respectful manner with first-class tickets and a small gift for their grandmother. She told them to move aside, saying they didn't belong up front, and blocked them without checking a single pass. The mother remained silent, the children held back their tears, but the father said, "I'll make one phone call," in 5 quiet words. A few minutes later, the plane stopped boarding, the captain emerged, and the woman who believed she had run everything was Clara Benton, who had worked for this airline long enough to believe she knew exactly who belonged in first class and who didn't, stood behind the gate counter with a stiff smile and an even more rigid posture. She scanned each ticket as if she were doing a favor for the passengers, barely looking at them before waving. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below, telling us where in the world you're watching from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a new one. Then a family moved forward, for well-dressed black passengers who were calm, respectful, and quiet. Stephen, the father, had a sleek carry-on and a navy wool coat. His wife, Teresa, had a small gold gift bag in her hand and a soft cashmere scarf wrapped around her shoulders. Their son, Daniel, who was perhaps 15, stood tall and silent, while their younger daughter, Alana, clutched her backpack and looked around curiously with her free hand firmly in her mother's. Stephen nodded politely and, "Economy is boarding at gate 6, she said, pointing towards the far end of the terminal. Teresa scowled softly, "These are first-class tickets." Clara hardly blinked. "I'm sure they are, but there must be a mistake. First class is reserved for elite passengers." She took one look at them, then at the family, and her smile tightened. She handed them back without scanning a single ticket. "We are platinum level, so please scan the passes," Stephen said without flinching. Clara hesitated, then took one ticket and scanned it. The green light beeped, so she scanned another one, but the same thing happened. "The system probably glitched," she said quickly. "Sometimes it reads things wrong, so you'll need to wait over there while we confirm." Alana looked up at her mother, perplexed. "Why can't we go in?" Teresa knelt next to her daughter, smoothing her hair. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just hold the gift. There's nothing to verify that our seats are legitimate. You've scanned them." Clara folded her arms. "Sir, I'm asking you to move aside so I can finish boarding." "No," Stephen said firmly, "you're refusing us for no reason." People in queue started to shift uneasily. A businessman behind them pretended to check his phone but didn't look away. A woman further back whispered to her companion, looking towards the gate. Clara leaned in slightly. "If you make this more difficult than it needs to be, you won't be getting pulled out his phone without saying anything else, stepped aside, and dialed. He said quietly, "Yes, there's a situation. Gate 4, she's refusing boarding without cause. Yes, all 4 tickets scanned." No explanation. Clara scoffed loud enough for people to hear. "Of course, always a phone call." Then the gate phone rang, and the younger agent nearby, Paul, picked it up. His posture changed as he said, "Yes, sir, yes, I understand." He hung up and briskly approached Clara, saying under his breath, "You need to stop boarding." Clara blinked. "What are you talking about?" The supervisor said to hold the flight, and the boarding stopped, the queue froze, and the low airport chatter around them felt like it was miles away. The family remained motionless and stood in silence, and every second that went by made it clear that something bigger had just been set in motion. Clara's face flushed with confusion, but she held her ground. Passengers started to shift again, some moving to the side for a better view, others whispering now without trying to hide it, and one woman took out her phone, pretending to check messages but already recording. Clara stood up straighter, her smile returning. She turned to Paul, her voice low and sharp, "You don't take orders from passengers' phone calls." Paul didn't respond, and his eyes remained fixed on the far end of the jet bridge where 2 figures had just come into view. One was wearing the 2 men approached like armor. The man in the suit walked calmly and deliberately, and his badge read Henry Walker, Regional Flight Operations Director. The man in the red-striped jacket, Luis Hernandez, was the airline's ground supervisor. Neither of them grinned, and Henry said in a measured voice, "Sir, there's been a mistake. This family tried to board first class." She paused, realizing that her response meant more than she had initially thought. "Yes, 2 of them. Louise interrupted her. Were they legitimate? Clara nodded grudgingly. They looked at Green, but I believed Henry glanced past her to the family who were still standing quietly a few feet away. He turned back to Clara. You were mistaken. He went to the podium, pulled up the passenger manifest, and tapped the screen. Paul stepped next to him and pointed to the names of Stephen, Teresa, Daniel, and Alana Moore, all of whom were listed under Priority Elite. There were 4 confirmed seats, rows 1A through 1D. Clara's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Louise turned to Paul and began reboarding. As the gate doors reopened and the boarding resumed, Stephen nodded slightly and welcomed the family forward. Teresa led Alana gently forward, the girl still holding the gold gift bag. Daniel followed behind, one hand brushing the edge of his blazer as if straightening it out of instinct. As they passed Clara, not a single one of them looked at a woman whose authority had been stripped in front of everyone without yelling, argument, or a scene. She didn't know who had been on the other end of that phone call, but they had just taken control of everything inside the aircraft. The cabin crew had just finished preparing first class, and Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years as the family vanished down the jet bridge. The weight of their silence pressed harder than anything she'd heard all day, and her heart pounded. The pit in her stomach deepened. All appeared normal until the jet bridge door opened and Paul ushered the Moore family forward. Stephen led his family into the cabin in silence, with Teresa following him and holding Alana's hand. Daniel walked steadily, his eyes sweeping the white leather seats and polished wood panels. The cabin smelled of fresh linen and citrus cleaner. Flight attendants quickly adjusted pillows and tucked in headsets before the rest of the passengers arrived. The lead flight attendant, Rachel Monroe, looked up from her last checks and was about to greet them when she noticed Paul stepping in behind them. She looked nervous and lowered her voice as she walked over, asking, "What's going on?" Paul leaned in Henry Walker, and the ground crew simply escorted them through Clara, denying them boarding. There was a call made, and his voice dropped further from. Rachel's eyes widened as she looked towards the family, who were now buckling in silence and composure. They didn't appear angry or even uncomfortable, but there was something about them that suggested they were still waiting for the next phase of a plan that hadn't been revealed yet. Back at the gate, Clara hadn't moved. She stood close to the corner of the counter, her arms crossed and her lips pressed tight. Her heart was racing, but she was too proud to show it. Luis went back to the desk with his tablet and said, "Go take a seat near the crew." Clara raised an eyebrow and said, "Mr. Walker will speak with you after the flight." "No, Clara, you're not," Luis responded. "You've been removed from active duty until further notice." For one mistake Luis didn't answer. He just nodded to the standby flight attendant who was already approaching, ready to take Clara's place. Clara's mouth opened to protest, but she saw passengers watching, phones pointed discreetly and whispers moving through the queue like wind. Her face burned. Instead, she moved away from the desk and sagged into the crew seat close to the far side of the gate. Once inside the plane, Rachel went up to the Moore family once more, this time bowing her head slightly. "If there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable," she said gently. "You've already done more than enough, thank you." Stephen smiled politely at her. Rachel nodded once before moving away. She didn't press or ask questions, but she sensed that something unsaid had changed in the air. Boarding went on, but the atmosphere was different. Passengers filed in more cautiously, aware that something odd had just happened at the gate. A few of them glanced awkwardly towards the front row, but quickly turned away when they saw Stephen watching. Then, as the doors started to close and the cabin calmed down, a silent message from corporate operations appeared on Rachel's tablet screen. It was 5 simple words: "Expect contact from executive office." Rachel looked up sharply, realizing that something big was about to happen. As the engines started to hum and the crew went through safety procedures, Rachel kept one eye on her tablet. She had worked dozens of flights and witnessed many mid-air incidents and last-minute changes, but she had never seen a message like that, just those 5 words from the highest level of airline command, "Come through." She looked towards the Moore family, and Stephen sat quietly with one leg crossed. The aircraft door closed with a heavy click, followed by the gentle chime of final cabin checks. The family wasn't tense, upset, or waiting. Instead, they were waiting. Rachel went to the front galley, tapped the intercom button, and asked to speak to the captain. A few moments later, Captain Mitchell emerged, tall and experienced, the kind of man whose presence naturally brought a hush to any room. Teresa patiently stroked Alana's hair as the girl leaned on her shoulder. Daniel had taken out a book, but hadn't turned a page. He was listening and watching like his father. "Executive office," he said quietly as he read the message on the tablet. "This came straight through." She nodded. "It's connected to what happened during boarding the family in 1A through 1D. The gate agent denied them. Someone made a call since then. Everything's changed." Captain Mitchell looked at the tablet for a long time before saying, "I'll contact dispatch." He then went back to the cockpit. Clara was sitting rigidly in the crew jump seat, her arms locked across her chest. She heard muted laughs from people who were obviously chatting about her or glanced at other passengers every few minutes. One man even passed by her and said, "You still have your badge, huh?" She ignored them, staring straight ahead. Her mind was racing, but her chest burned with embarrassment. Why had the flight stopped for them? Who had that kind of influence? A call can't stop an entire aircraft unless it comes from her stomach sank. Yes, she had made assumptions, but she had done it 100 times before. No one had ever questioned her in this way. Passengers would typically become irate and possibly file a complaint, but this wasn't the case. Up in the cockpit, the captain's call was answered almost immediately. No dispatch or even the typical line supervisor answered, but a calm, deliberate voice said, "This is Martin Reeves, Chief of Airline Strategy. We understand you have 4 passengers seated in 1A to 1D. Please confirm." The captain responded in a clear, steady tone, "Family of 4 all seated. The caller isn't just anybody, he's our major shareholder and the man who signed our last merger deal. His name is Stephen Moore." The line went silent, and the captain sat back slowly, his eyes wide, and he looked through the cockpit door window at the man sitting in 1A comm. It wasn't necessary to maintain the current flight plan, and when you land, keep all crew members on board and don't release them until instructed. The ground response team will be waiting. In first class, however, nobody spoke. The quiet wasn't awkward, it was measured and controlled. Stephen leaned back in his seat, eyes closed but not asleep. Teresa gently unfolded a blanket over Alana, who had already started to drift off. Daniel sat motionless, staring out the window, and then he realized that this flight had already changed and they hadn't even left the ground. The plane lifted into the sky with a smooth, steady climb, and passengers settled into their seats, the low hum of conversation blending with the gentle whir of the engines. Clara's legs bounced nervously in the rear crew jump seat. Rachel tried to keep her face blank, but the whispers hadn't stopped. Even crew members were starting to change their behavior. Rachel moved through the cabin offering water, but her hands weren't as steady as usual. She kept stealing glances at the family. Every time she passed, she felt a pressure in her chest like she wasn't just serving drinks anymore, but walking through something far more important than she understood. Finally, she got up and went up to Rachel near the galley. "I need to speak to the captain," she whispered, trying to sound calm. Rachel didn't even blink. "You're not allowed on the flight deck, this is serious." Clara hissed, "I need to explain what happened before this gets blown out before it's already blown out." Clara stood frozen, and Rachel lowered her voice further. The only thing that made her invisible was the constant heat of judgment pressing in from all sides. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but Rachel turned her away, leaving Clara standing by herself near the drink cart. That heavy, cold moment was when it finally set in that this wasn't about a seat, this wasn't about a policy, this was about judgment, and hers had just ended her life. "Man," Clara didn't answer. "He's not just flying for fun, he's the reason we're all getting paid next month. His signature is on every fleet expansion." Career back in the cockpit, Captain Mitchell sat silently, his eyes fixed on the horizon, but his mind was going over every word of the executive call. He had never been told to keep crew after landing in midair. That only happened in cases of serious internal cases or legal violations, and this one wasn't going to be ignored. He looked down at his screen and saw another message. Prepare incident statement. Internal Affairs will conduct interviews upon arrival. All communications to be logged. That was the... They all saw what happened at the gate and felt the shift when the Moore family boarded. When they realized this wasn't just any family, Stephen hadn't moved much since takeoff. The hours went by slowly, the plane cut through calm skies, but inside the air felt heavier with every mile. First class remained unusually quiet. Even the passengers who usually ordered wine or asked for extra pillows seemed cautious and unsure of how to behave. Teresa leaned her head against the window, watching the clouds pass, and her hand rested gently on Alana's shoulder. Daniel had finally opened his book, but it appeared that he had been reading the same page for the past 20 minutes. Rachel was making another quiet round with warm towels, and she hesitated before bending slightly towards Stephen. If you or your family need anything at all, please don't hesitate. Stephen turned to her and met her eyes. For the first time, his expression was composed but powerful. You've been kind, he said simply. That's enough. Rachel nodded softly and went on down the aisle, her heart racing. That man didn't raise his voice because he didn't have to. She had served executives before, some loud, some challenging, but none like Stephen Moore, who had the kind of presence that made people check themselves. Back in the rear crew section, Clara couldn't sit still any longer. She stood close to the galley with H. Stiff with fear, she had repeatedly replayed in her mind what she had done, how she had looked at that family, how she had assumed they were wrong, how she hadn't even looked at all 4 tickets before concluding they didn't belong, and how her pride continued to try to change the story. It was merely a misunderstanding, it was procedure. Anyone could have made the same call, but she knew deep down that wasn't the case. She hadn't questioned because of policy, she had questioned because of assumption, and now, sitting in the back of the aircraft, the curtain separating first class from the rest of the cabin had never felt so symbolic. She wasn't just physically removed, she was pulled out of the world she thought she belonged in. The chatter among the rest of the crew was different as well. Normally, during cruise time, they would joke quietly, share snack packs, and gossip about passengers, but today they hardly spoke, and when they did, it wasn't to her. She overheard bits as they. The leadership silence was worse than being yelled at, and she slammed her hands into fists beneath the galley counter. The call she expected from the supervisor never came, and there was no support or backup, just a stillness that told her the damage was already done. Clara's eyes drifted to the front of the cabin, where she couldn't see through the curtain but could feel Stephen, Teresa, and the kids calm and unaffected by the commotion. HR is going to eat this alive. The hum of the engines filled the cabin like background music, but to Clara, it was louder than ever. Every minute felt like an hour, and every look from her fellow crew members felt loaded. She had tried to keep her chin up and pretend that this was just a minor mix-up. And in that moment, for the first time in all her years of flying, Clara Benton realized something brutal. The people she once looked down on were the ones quietly watching her fall, and they didn't have to say a word to make it. Would go by, but nothing did. The silence surrounding her grew more intense, and no one, not even the junior flight attendant who had reprimanded her for folding napkins incorrectly, was looking at her anymore. In the cockpit, Captain Mitchell clenched his jaw as he reviewed the most recent directive. A new message from Operations Oversight read, "Ensure incident report is fully submitted within 1 hour of landing." Passenger Moore was flagged as a top executive priority. The legal team and HR would meet the crew at the gate. Mitchell rubbed his back in first class. Daniel finally spoke. He leaned towards his father and asked, "Do you think she understands what she did?" Stephen didn't respond correctly. He had flown senators, athletes, and celebrities, but this time, Stephen Moore wasn't a celebrity. He didn't need the spotlight, but he owned the room the moment he walked in, and Mitchell could feel it in his bones. This man wasn't seeking retribution. He didn't need to shout or argue because he had already set the wheels in motion. Daniel nodded once, then turned back to his son. "Understanding isn't something you hear in words," he said softly, "you see it in silence." Rachel, who had just passed row 2, heard it. She didn't mean to listen, but those words stuck in her chest. Stephen's voice was free of anger and bitterness, just a quiet truth that made everything around it feel smaller. She continued down the aisle and stopped in the galley where Ben, a young flight attendant in his second month, stood refilling cups and asked, "Is it true?" under his breath. "That's the Stephen Moore, the shareholder." Rachel nodded slightly, and the system confirmed it. Operations called the flight deck straight away, and Ben's eyes widened. "Wow, I heard she blocked them without scanning all the tickets," Ben said. "She did," Rachel confirmed. Ben glanced towards the back. "She's done, isn't she?" Rachel didn't answer right away. She didn't want to take pleasure in someone else's fall, but the truth was she had seen Clara make life miserable for junior staff for years, belittling them, correcting them in front of passengers, mocking those who didn't match her idea of first-class worthy. "She's not getting off this plane the same way she got on," Rachel said finally. "That much is certain." Meanwhile, Clara sat alone in her seat, trying to will time to move faster. Her hands gripped her armrests so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She had tried messaging her union rep earlier, but there was no signal. Her heart pounded harder with every update from the cockpit, every subtle shift in the crew's tone. Then Rachel appeared beside her, standing stiff and unreadable. Clara looked up, startled. "They want you in the front," Rachel said. Clara blinked. "Now?" Rachel nodded. "The captain says there's someone from corporate trying to connect. They want to speak with you directly." Clara stood slowly, brushing off her uniform like it still meant something. Her legs felt heavy, her mouth had gone dry. She followed Rachel towards the front, each step down the narrow aisle feeling like a courtroom walk. As they reached the cockpit entrance, Captain Mitchell stepped out holding a headset with a coiled cord. "They're waiting," he said without being rude or soft-hearted. Clara switched to the headset. There was a brief period of silence before a low, calm, and unmistakably confident voice said, "Miss Benton, this is Raymond Spencer from Corporate Ethics." Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. "You're aware of the situation, I assume?" Clara swallowed hard. "I didn't mean I thought." "Don't explain," the voice said evenly. "Not yet, just listen." And Clara did. She stood there with her headset pressed to her ear while the man on the other end, who had never spoken to her before, spoke clearly before this flight landed. "Is not a minor issue. This is not a routine report. You made a decision that put the company at risk legally and publicly." Clara felt her breath catch. "You didn't just treat a passenger disrespectfully, you treated the owner disrespectfully." Then, suddenly, the last control she had been holding on to snapped, and she stood motionless at the cockpit doorway, her hands shaking slightly but not daring to let them drop from her sides. Heard Raymond Spencer from Corporate Ethics speak with a level of composure that was colder than any yell could ever be. "This isn't just about a delay," he said. "It's about the message your actions sent, and unfortunately, this isn't your first flag. There are past records, multiple crew complaints, 3 prior passenger reports, and at least 1 ignored warning from internal compliance. You made a decision without verifying facts. You didn't check all 4 boarding passes." Clara opened her mouth too. Clara wanted to argue that it wasn't like that she was only trying to enforce procedure, but every excuse she tried to make fell apart before it could be formed. "You'll remain on this flight," Raymond continued. "Upon landing, you'll be escorted to the administrative office at the terminal. You are not to speak to fellow staff or passengers. Security will be on duty. You didn't ask for supervisor clearance. You didn't follow protocol." He paused, "but more than that, you judged them." The headset felt heavy on her ear. "Present, do you understand?" Clara closed her eyes for a moment, trying to suppress the wave of nausea rising in her chest. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, what?" "Yes, I understand." The line disconnected without saying goodbye, and she slowly took off the headset, her hands now clammy. Captain Mitchell said nothing, just nodding towards the front jump seat near the cockpit and stepping back inside, closing the door. Clara sat down like she was sitting on glass, her thoughts a jumble of what-ifs, and it was. With her head resting on her mother's lap and her hand still loosely gripping the gold gift bag handle, Alana had fallen asleep. Teresa gently adjusted her daughter's jacket while whispering something that only mothers could understand. Stephen looked out the window, impossible to read, his fingers resting close to the armrest. Daniel finally put his book down and leaned in to ask his mother, "Will she lose her job?" He said softly. Teresa didn't respond right away. She first glanced at her son and then at her husband. Stephen spoke without turning his head. She lost it the moment she thought she had more value than we did. Daniel nodded, though the weight of those words settled slowly. A few rows back, other first-class passengers whispered behind raised hands. One man, clearly uncomfortable, said they didn't even raise their voice, just one call, and everything changed. His companion replied, "That's what happens when someone powerful gets treated like they belong nowhere." Or, the first man muttered, "when someone finally says enough." Even the flight attendants now moved with a strange tension, less chatter, more precision. Orders were taken quickly, but no one lingered. The energy had shifted. There was a new awareness in the cabin, an invisible pressure wrapped around the crew. Everyone could feel it. In the back galley, the junior flight attendant Ben whispered to Rachel, "Is it true she's getting pulled the second we land?" Rachel nodded. "The flight administrator wants her to be escorted before being debriefed at the security meeting, and she won't be returning from." Rachel's voice was low, and no one returned from reprimanding the man who owns your airline. Clara sat forward, now hunched slightly, trying to blend in. She had once walked the cabin with confidence, correcting uniforms, reprimanding staff over meal prep, and talking down to passengers she felt were out of place, but now she was invisible in the worst way possible. No one looked at her with respect, only pity, satisfaction, or quiet knowing judgment. She tried to breathe, but the air didn't feel like it belonged to her anymore. Thoughts of damage control raced through her head. Perhaps she could have apologized in public, provided a written statement, or pleaded with HR, but she knew deep down that none of it would matter, not to them, not to the passengers, and most definitely not to Stephen Moore. He hadn't yelled, he hadn't created a scene, but with a single, composed private call, he had altered her entire future, not with retaliation, which had consequences, and that Clara now understood was far more permanent. The flight approached its destination, and the captain's voice came. For a few passengers, the announcement was a routine one, but for Clara, it was the beginning of the end. For Stephen, it was the quiet countdown to closure, and for the crew, it was the moment they had all been quietly anticipating since the gate. Over the intercom, the flight attendants were calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent. Please fasten your seatbelts and make sure all tray tables are in their upright position." Clara had never doubted her place in this company and had never feared correction, let alone removal, but now she couldn't stop shaking on the inside, where it mattered more, and replayed every second at the gate in her mind. The call had turned the day upside down. She stared at the seatbelt sign as it lit up above her like it had a different meaning. The seat beneath her felt too hard, her uniform too tight, and the tension in her shoulders had become almost unbearable. She had not even looked at the girls' ticket or the boys'. She had assumed they didn't look the part because, in her mind, first class had a certain image and they didn't fit it. Now that she didn't even fit in the jump seat, Rachel approached her slowly and quietly while holding a sealed envelope. The captain said in a dry voice, "They're waiting for you when we land instructions." In this instance, the tone she used and the assumptions she made were repeated. The Moore family remained composed at the front of the plane. Clara took the envelope with shaking fingers, but she didn't need to open it because she already knew what it said. "You know," Rachel added almost gently, "there was a time when you were one of the best on this crew." Clara looked up, surprised that Rachel didn't smile. "You knew the rulebook better than anyone, but you forgot something somewhere along the way." "What's that?" Clara's voice cracked. "That the rules are for protecting people, not judging them." Daniel had pulled out a notebook and was writing something, possibly thoughts, maybe nothing, but his expression was focused. Teresa leaned towards Stephen and whispered, "Do you think she understands?" Stephen replied without turning away from the window, "It's not about her understanding, it's about what others saw, what they remember." Teresa gently wiped Alana's cheeks with a serviette. The little girl had slept through the majority of the flight, unaware of the storm. Teresa nodded gently. "Then, perhaps this was more important than we realize." Stephen looked into her eyes, exhausted but composed. "It was important because it wasn't just about us, it was about everyone who has been marginalized, disregarded, and doubted, and today someone saw what is typically hidden." Back in the galley, Ben watched the runway start to emerge in the distance through the small window next to the service door. He looked first at Clara and then at the first-class curtain that was closed. "Do you think he planned it?" He asked Rachel whether he was aware of how far this might. The plane dipped lower wheels, dropping into place with a mechanical where the cabin jolted softly. Passengers sat up straighter, fastened belts, and put items back into bags, the usual last movements before landing, but the mood was anything but normal. Rachel folded a tray cloth and didn't immediately answer the phone. I believe he hoped it wouldn't go that far, so I think he gave her a chance to fix it. Ben nodded slowly, but she didn't take it. His part was done, and now the rest of the world would decide what to do with what they saw. As the plane approached the runway, Clara clutched the envelope in her hand, her heart thumping, her mouth dry, and she knew that her future was gone. However, what scared her the most was not just the loss of her job, but also the fact that every passenger on this plane had just witnessed her final flight and none of them had responded. The message glowed on the lock screen. Legal team and press briefing was scheduled. There was no longer any normalcy in Clara's world. The wheels touched the ground with a gentle thud, but to her it felt like the plane had crashed into concrete. The customary hollow and fleeting smattering of polite applause echoed briefly through the cabin, and passengers started to stir, reaching for bags, stretching stiff limbs, and talking in soft tones. For Clara, however, this landing was not the end of a journey, but rather the beginning of a reckoning. She sat motionless, holding her envelope tightly in her lap, breathing shallow and even Ben, the youngest and typically most eager to please, kept his eyes fixed on the galley cabinet, acting as though he was rearranging cups that didn't need to be rearranged. Captain Mitchell made his final announcement from the front. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome." Her name badge felt heavier than it had ever been, and she was painfully aware of the crew members' avoidance of her. "Please stay seated with your seatbelts fastened until the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of our entire crew, we would like to thank you for traveling with us today." At the front of the plane, Rachel pulled back the curtains separating first class from the rest of the cabin. Stephen and his family sat motionless. Alana woke up just moments before rubbing her eyes, and Teresa remained motionless. The ding of the seatbelt light shutting off caused a new flurry of movement, but none of it involved Clara. "Ground team has arrived," she said quietly, "and they're waiting just outside the jet bridge." Daniel closed his notebook and tucked it neatly into his backpack. Stephen stayed calm, his body relaxed but his mind clearly focused. Rachel approached them. "Ground team has arrived," she said softly, brushing her daughter's hair back with a mother's gentle grace. After a moment of hesitation, Rachel leaned in slightly and said, "There's reporters outside too. Just letting you know." Teresa glanced at her husband and said, "You told them?" Passengers started to stand retrieving bags and filing towards the aisle, but nobody hurried or shoved. Instead, they turned their heads towards the front, some slowly and not so subtly, towards the Moore family and towards Clara. In first class, a man in a blazer leaned towards Stephen. I shook his head, saying, "I didn't have to, because they were already watching everything." "Back at the gate," he said in a low voice, "what did you do that was powerful?" Stephen looked at him and calmly replied, "I didn't do anything, I just didn't let it go." Clara saw them turn towards the front, heads turning, people whispering, and she knew that everyone was watching. A woman a few rows back even held her phone at chest level, with the lens angled just enough to record. She didn't try to hide it, she didn't need to. Flanked a woman wearing a sleek gray business suit with silver trim. Her name tag said Nora Fielding Corporate Affairs, and although her face was unreadable, her presence shouted finality. Rachel moved aside as Nora entered the plane, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She briefly made eye contact with Rachel before asking, "Miss Benton?" to Captain Mitchell, who had emerged from the cockpit. Clara stood slowly, her hands shaking, and she clutched the envelope like a lifeline, saying, "Please collect." Then came the walk down the aisle. Clara once marched confidently past passengers she had reprimanded, ignored, and smiled at with fake grace, past the faces now watching her as if she were a lesson, some with pity, some with satisfaction, and many with no words. "Your personal belongings and follow us." Clara looked around once at the passengers, crew, and the space she used to own. Rachel handed her a bag with her belongings neatly packed, already removed from the overhead bin. Clara accepted it silently. judgment when she arrived at first class. Her eyes briefly met those of Stephen Moore. He didn't smirk or glare, he didn't need to. He looked at her the way someone would look at an old uniform that has been worn out and thrown away because it is no longer useful. Teresa, who was still seated, spoke softly, without mockery or cruelty, just calmly. I hope this teaches you more than it costs you. The door to the jet bridge closed behind Clara with a thud that reverberated louder in her head than in the hallway when her foot touched the carpeted floor of the terminal. It no longer felt like an airport. Clara's throat tightened, she nodded without responding, her face burning, and then she stepped out of the aircraft, out of her role, and out of the world she had built her identity around. The hallway beyond was lined with quiet people in dark suits and cold eyes. There was no applause this time, just silence and the faint sound of her footsteps fading behind her. Felt like a stage, a silent, sterile hallway where every step was watched, recorded and remembered. The two security guards didn't touch her, but they were close enough to make their intentions obvious. Nora led the way with her heels clicking in a steady rhythm, and Clara followed her like a shadow behind her shoulders, her eyes hunched and low, hoping no one else would recognize her. Of course they did, even in the short distance between the gate and the lift. The lift doors opened and Nora entered without a word. The silence grew heavier as the doors closed, and Clara looked at Nora, who was standing with her tablet in one hand without ever looking up. Can I speak to someone from HR before this goes any further? She asked, not looking at the gate agents who were whispering to themselves near the terminal counter. One of them, whom Clara had previously publicly reprimanded for using the incorrect intercom phrase, looked directly at her now, but the lift chimed, the doors opened, and Clara felt her stomach turn. You don't understand, I didn't do it out of hate, I made a judgment call, she said. You'll be speaking to them in about 10 minutes. There's nothing informal about what just happened, Clara said, adding a tight voice. There's nothing informal about what just happened. You'll be processed according to company procedure. Your file has been pulled. Your access has been revoked. Clara had been in this area of the terminal before, but only during training years ago. It felt clean and impressive back then, but now it felt cold and final. They passed a receptionist who nodded to Nora, and no words were exchanged. Clara followed her through a side door into a small conference room without windows. Inside, a man in a navy blue suit, Ethan Briggs, a human resources supervisor, was sitting. He was courteous and painfully efficient. A sealed folder rested on the floor. Miss Benton, Ethan said politely, please have a seat. Clara sank into the chair across from him, and Nora stood motionless by the door. Ethan opened the folder and took out a stack of forms that said, "You're being formally removed from duty effective immediately. This document outlines your termination based on conduct violation including failure to follow procedure, mistreatment of passengers and damage to the airline's public image." Clara's mouth dropped open, but I wasn't given a warning eye. Clara stared at the papers with the bold title at the top, Termination of Employment Final Notice. She tried to slow her thoughts and steady her breathing so that she could form a sentence that might save her. I've been with this airline for 12 years. Ethan's tone didn't change. It's not about who he is, it's about what you did. The status of the passenger only escalated the response, but the action itself, your assumptions, your words, your refusal to verify, are the violations. Clara shook her head and gripped the edge of the table, saying, "You're going to fire me because of one mistake." Ethan looked her in the eyes for the first time and said, "We're not firing you for one mistake, but because this mistake revealed something we can't ignore anymore. You've received multiple flags, behavior notes, passenger concerns, nothing serious enough to remove you until now." The room went quiet. Clara couldn't think, her hands felt numb. She wanted to speak, but every word she could have said felt too small now. "Please sign here," Ethan said, sliding the form towards her. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the pen. She paused over the signature line, a last flicker of hope blinking behind her eyes. "Is there anything I can do?" Ethan didn't flinch. "You can sign," she signed. He slid another form across the table and said, "You'll also return your badge, access card, and uniform. You'll be escorted to the employee center to pick up your belongings. You are not to contact current employees without clearance." Clara nodded slowly. What happens next? Ethan closed the folder. You leave. The Moore family asked quietly, what happens with them? We're not pressing charges. We're not filing a lawsuit. They didn't have to. He looked at Nora, who spoke at last. Far more permanent. Clara blinked. What do you mean? Nora leaned forward a little, her voice lower now. They were restrained. They didn't shout or threaten. They made a single phone call, and that call demonstrated to everyone how powerful quiet dignity can be. Clara sat back in her chair in her heartbreaking, slow, painful silence, and in that silence, she finally realized what Stephen had taught everyone on that plane: loud doesn't equal strength, position doesn't equal power, and silence when held with truth. Is it possible to change everything? Clara left the conference room with her badge taken off, her access card deactivated, and a final copy of her termination letter folded neatly in the crook of her arm like a death certificate. Her hands trembled as she gripped her travel bag, her knuckles turning pale in the fluorescent lighting. It was all real now, not a warning, not a suspension, not a brief slip-up. She had been kicked out of the very industry she had built her identity around. Nora walked ahead, silently guiding her back. Every hallway they went through was more humiliating than the last. The terminal buzzed on the other side of the glass walls, with passengers laughing, rolling suitcases, rushing towards flights, and boarding announcements ringing through the air. It was just another day at the airport, but for Clara, it was the longest walk of her life. The two security officers stayed close by, quiet, courteous, and present, and she didn't resist because there was nothing left to resist. A young man from operations handed her a plastic bin labeled with her name, which contained her spare uniform pieces, her badge pouch, a half-used notepad with scrawled reminders, and a coffee mug that read Cabin Boss. The sight of it made her chest hurt, and Nora stood off to the side, reviewing something on her tablet, giving Clara space but not too much. She had used it 100 times before when she arrived early to brief junior attendants or enforce last-minute uniform checks. Clara turned to her and asked, "Is anyone going to talk to me about next steps?" Severance HR follow-up. Nora didn't look up. You'll receive a packet by mail. Your employee file has been flagged as per policy. You're barred from employment at any airline partnered under our corporate network. Clara's breath caught. Flagged. Nora met her eyes now red. Level. The incident, along with your behavioral history, has triggered permanent classification. Clara felt the blood drain from her face, but that's for sure. Clara sank onto a bench in the corner of the room to protect passengers from repeat misconduct after Nora finished. She didn't say anything for a long time, just stared at the contents of the bin as if they were someone else's. After 12 years of flights, thousands of hours in the air, and being reduced to a single plastic box in its final form. Her mind searched for any justification, defense, or detail she could cling to. She had been proud of her work, and she had trained new. She had memorized all of the policies, and she had been stern, fast, and unforgiving. She had dismissed people based on their appearance, speech, and movement, and she had corrected passengers who didn't need to be corrected. This time, she had made an assumption about the wrong family, not just because of who they were, but also because of what they were able to avoid doing. They didn't yell, threaten, or even demand an apology. They just made one call, and everything changed forever. Clara's phone buzzed in her. Her heart leaped for a moment as she pulled it out. Perhaps someone from management was about to say that it had gone too far, but when she did, the screen displayed the name of a former coworker, Linda, whom she hadn't spoken to in over a year. Clara answered quickly, desperate for a familiar voice, "Hello." There was a pause, followed by a hesitant voice, which I heard when I saw the footage, and Clara swallowed it. "It's not what it looks like. I didn't mean it the way they're making it sound." Another pause, and Linda's voice fell to a whisper, "Clara." They didn't say anything. For the first time in a long time, Nora looked over and was ready to leave. Clara nodded, stood, and picked up the bin. They left through a side corridor that led directly to the employee parking structure. The security officers followed silently until they reached the exit. The problem: you did all the damage before anyone opened their mouth. Clara's mouth opened to speak, but the line had already gone dead. She stared at the phone still pressed to her ear. "You're not banned from flying as a passenger," Nora said to Clara one final time, "but don't wear your uniform again and don't expect silence from the media." Clara stepped outside into the harsh daylight, and the air hit her hard as if the sky had changed. She walked towards the parking lot, unsure of where to go or what to do next, but knowing one thing with painful clarity: the Moore family didn't simply walk onto a plane that day, they entered her life and showed her what true power looks like. Clara Benton would have to face the one thing she had always thought she was above accountability for, like when it doesn't raise its voice. She sat in her car for what seemed like hours, the keys still clenched in her hand, the engine off. The sun had started to shift across the parking lot, casting long shadows through her windscreen, but she couldn't move. Her bag sat next to her, the box of her belongings in the back seat, silent final reminders of a job she no longer had in a world that She thought she had earned it all, that she belonged at the top of the chain, and that first class was a space she had the right to protect. However, over the past few hours, the truth had slowly seeped in like water finding its way through cracks. What she had protected wasn't the airline, it wasn't safety, it wasn't professionalism, it was her ego. She had once thought this place was hers, the uniform, the seniority, the reputation. She walked terminals with confidence, spoke to passengers with command, enforced rules with pride, and the quiet voice in her head that told her she could choose who belonged, and when that voice was questioned, she didn't change her mind. Now, she was sitting in a car that felt like a box, unable to drive and unable to think clearly by herself. She opened her phone and scrolled through contacts, including people she had led on flights, coworkers, supervisors she had trained, and others who had texted her earlier with ambiguous messages like "I'm sorry," "Are you okay?" "Rough day," but as the story spread, the silence grew. She tapped a name, Derek, her long time. Clara put the phone down slowly, her eyes welling not from injustice or outrage but from the terrifying realization that this wasn't just a firing but an eraser. She tried calling another Tracy, a colleague who had shared dozens of long-haul flights with her, but it rang twice and went straight to voicemail. She tried calling another Cameron, the attendant she had defended during an in-flight incident years ago, but the industry was small. She opened her email expecting a message from HR or something official, but instead she was inundated with alerts, news articles and social media mentions. One blurry photo showed her standing at the gate, another showed her leaving the plane with her head down, flanked by security. The flight attendant was removed after refusing to let her family board, and the first-class CEO's quiet power move left crew members stunned. They made one call, and the industry-wide conversation about bias was SP. She got what she deserved, the calmness of that man chilling in the best way. Imagine believing you have power until the real owner speaks up. She appeared confident until she wasn't, and every comment was another truth she tried to ignore. She opened the article and saw a quote from a passenger who had seen everything. He didn't yell or make a scene, he simply said, "I'll make a call." And then everything stopped. She closed her eyes, and she realized that everything had changed, but all he had done was pick up a phone. There had been no threats, lawsuits, social media rants, calls, sentences, or lawsuits. She recalled how he had looked at her, not with anger or even contempt, but with a calm disappointment that went deeper than anger could. It was the way her father used to look at her when she did something selfish, the way a teacher looks when you betray their trust, and the way people look at you. Clara put her head against the steering wheel, her breath shallow as the realization finally set in. She had lost not only her job, but also her place in the world, and she could still hear Teresa's voice, soft and unshaken. "I hope this teaches you more than it cost you." She hadn't understood it at the time, and she had been too embarrassed and angry, but now, alone in the silence, she did. This wasn't just about her mistake, it was about what it revealed, and for the first time in her life, Clara Benton realized that she was not the strong, collected flight attendant she had always imagined, but rather someone who had been granted authority and had abused it. The only people who really paid for it were those who didn't even raise their voices. Long after the majority of the terminal had cleared out and the sun had set, darkness descended on the sky, with the airport's floodlights creating long shadows over the almost empty lot. She still hadn't turned the ignition key and hadn't even reached for it. The weight in her chest didn't go away. It wasn't just guilt, it was something deeper and worse, the realization that she had turned into the kind of employee she used to hate in others, the one who made snap decisions, acted haughtily, and refused to see people for who they were. She had always taken pride in upholding standards and keeping things professional, but those words now rang hollow in her head. When she didn't see a family that day, she saw disruption and a threat to her authority, so she took action. Her phone lit up with more news alerts, and one article now contained a brief statement from the airline. She opened it slowly, reading each word as if it were a sentence being handed down. "We don't tolerate behavior that goes against the values of inclusivity and respect. This incident is being thoroughly reviewed, and immediate action has already been taken." A video had been posted by one of the passengers, a shaky but clear recording taken during the confrontation at the gate. The sound was clear, showing her voice sharp and dismissive, telling the family to stand aside and wait for rebooking. The children's faces showed the discomfort, confusion, and calmness of the situation. "We have taken steps to address the matter in accordance with company policy. We extend our deepest apologies to the Moore family." They didn't name her because everyone already knew. She scrolled further. For years, Clara had felt that experience gave her the right to assert control and that seniority allowed for certainty, but the truth was now painfully obvious. None of that meant anything without humility, respect, and the ability to pause and think before deciding someone's worth. She recalled moments she had dismissed without thinking, and the father said quietly, "If you're sure about this, I'll make the call." The comments were harsh but well-deserved. The industry she had dedicated her life to, where she once felt powerful, respected, and in control, had closed its doors to her completely. Clara instinctively reached for her badge again, only to realize it was no longer clipped to her uniform. People asked her to change seats because they didn't look like they belonged there. They were dressed too casually in business class, quiet families, and spoken to like intruders. She had never hit anyone or shouted, but she had made them feel small. She looked at the seat next to her cabin boss mug, which was in the bin in her back seat. The lettering was bold and cruel, and she stared at it for a moment before opening the car door and stepping out into the cold night and dropping it into the nearby trash can without ceremony. The sound of the porcelain breaking at the bottom reverberated up from the metal walls, which was more final than she had anticipated. She leaned against her car and looked up at the night sky, and planes sliced through the air above her just. Somewhere up there were blinking lights in the distance. Another crew was serving drinks, adjusting seatbelts, and getting ready to land. Another family might be traveling. Perhaps another gate agent would make the same decision as hers, or perhaps not. Perhaps someone had watched the video, read the comments, or stopped talking too quickly before allowing bias to pass for protocol. Perhaps someone would learn from her mistake, and that Clara believed was all that mattered, not her career, her reputation, or her record, but whether someone somewhere could see what she had done and say, "I won't be like her." She got back in the car, turned on the ignition this time, and let it run. Her hands were on the steering wheel, but she hadn't driven yet. There was no plan, no direction, just the road ahead and the long, painful truth that sometimes the biggest losses aren't taken from you, they're what you throw away yourself because you thought you were. The following morning, the world had already changed. News feeds were updated with fresh headlines, airports were bustling with passengers boarding and routine planes departing, and flight crews went about their checklists without missing a beat. However, for Clara, time had changed, becoming slower, heavier, and more honest. She hadn't slept, and her phone was lying face down on the bedside table, silenced for a long time. She had stopped reading the comments and stopped responding to messages that weren't genuinely about support. Her airline email had been deactivated, and her uniform, which had once been neat and ironed with pride, hung awkwardly on a doorknob in her hallway like it belonged to a stranger. She wandered aimlessly through her apartment, which was filled with framed photos from crew dinners, training graduations, layovers, and proud poses. However, each frame now looked less like a celebration and more like a collection of moments held hostage by a person she knew. She paused in front of a photograph that was taken during her 5th year. She was wearing uniform, standing tall next to a captain on the tarmac with the plane shining behind them. She recalled thinking at the time, "I've made it." But what had she really accomplished? A 12-year career that ended in 12 seconds, not because of a single passenger or family, but rather because of a habit or pattern of believing that power came with the right to determine who was worthy. She poured herself a coffee and listened to the silence. She couldn't forget the daughter's bewildered eyes looking up and asking, "Why can't we go in?" or the mother's quiet grace in never raising her voice, or the son standing motionless, dignified beyond his years, listening to every word, or, most importantly, the father Stephen, who was so calm, so still, and so certain that he hadn't needed volume, hadn't needed anger, he made a single phone call, and in doing so, he did more than just alter her destiny, he made it public. Clara recalled the last time she passed him at the jet bridge, escorted like a criminal. He hadn't gloated or smirked. Instead, he had just watched her eyes calmly, as if he was simply disappointed, and that disappointment had been more painful than anything else. She opened her laptop out of habit and typed in the airline crew login portal, but was greeted with an error message that read, "Access denied, employee ID not." She opened a blank document, her throat tightened, and she realized that there was no way to undo what had happened. She had no plan, no purpose, just an impulse. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a long time before she began typing, "To the Moore family." She stopped breathing, then continued, "But now she realizes that I never saw you clearly. I didn't see the father attempting to protect his family, the mother holding her daughter's hand, or the boy who stood there with Moore." She paused and went on, "I was wrong and I deserve every consequence, but I wanted to say it because no one made me, because sometimes the people we try our hardest to ignore teach us the most important lessons. You showed the world what true strength looks like, quiet, unwavering strength. I hope your children remember that moment not as a humiliation but as a reminder that dignity triumphs even when the world looks the other way. Tries to deny it a seat." She hit save, but she didn't send it. She didn't know where to send it. Maybe she didn't deserve it, but she had to write it. She shut down the laptop, sat back and allowed herself to feel the weight of it all. Clara Benton's fall wasn't dramatic or pitiful, rather, it was slow, silent and sharp, unfolding in real time. It was exposed by a single moment that held her accountable, not by scandal, and the people who made the difference didn't yell or quarrel. Didn't even speak up. They just stood where they were supposed to stand and waited. Now that the world had seen the truth, not just about one flight attendant but about a whole culture of covert bias concealed behind uniforms and policies, it opened eyes. For Clara Benton, that was the moment when everything finally landed. If this story touched you, please like it, leave a comment, and remember to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories in the future.